We were founded in 1974, and since that time, we have provided more than $2 million in unrestricted grants to more than 600 University of Hawaii students. As I mentioned, our foundation is committed to advancing science in America. Competitiveness is still an issue all these years later. And so we continue to raise money for ARC Scholar Awards. And we have to fundraise to do that. So we do encourage donations if you're available, if you're interested and have the means to do that. We will have a screen at the end with our link to our information. So in addition to supporting outstanding graduate students, we annually recognize a Scientist of the Year. And that person is someone on the University of Hawaii faculty who has a remarkable record of research in their own right, as well as mentorship of up and coming young scientists, and in this case, also a record of public education and public service. We just received from the engraver our bowl for the ARCS Award for this year, so we will be getting that to Dr. Mark Hickson, who is our 2021 honoree. Dr. Mark Hickson received his PhD from UC Santa Barbara, where he was a member of the surfing team. He was a National Science Foundation funded postdoctoral fellow at the University of Hawaii before spending 28 years on the faculty at Oregon State University. In 2013, UH lured him back to the islands to fill the Sydney and Erica Shao Endowed Chair in Marine Biology. Among his early influencers are his parents for career and recreation choices that took him to coastlines around the world. Lloyd Bridges, for those of us old enough to remember, who introduced him to scuba on TV. Jacques Cousteau, for interesting him in marine biology. And teachers and professors who aren't household names for most of us, but had a profound influence on his career. They did their job well. In 2004, Dr. Hickson was the most cited author on coral reef ecology. He serves on the editorial boards of multiple academic journals and has chaired advisory committees for both NOAA and the National Science Foundation. And he inspires doctoral candidates in his own laboratory. I don't want to spend a lot of time on the introduction because he has a lot of interesting information to share. So I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Hickson. Welcome.
Thank you so much, Cheryl. And thanks to everyone on the ARCS Foundation. I'm honored and truly humbled to be added to a list of UH Manoa faculty whom I respect and admire. And so this is really wonderful. Thank you all so much. I'm especially grateful to the ARCS Foundation for supporting graduate education in the sciences, especially these days when science, unfortunately, is increasingly under attack in our society. Graduate students are the future of science, and no society can survive that rejects science. And I've personally been blessed with wonderful graduate students throughout my career, and that includes my current cohort, Eric Brush, Eric Dilley, Daniela Escantrela, and Ryan Jones. So let me switch on the slides here and get started. There we go. Aloha to everyone coming to this talk. I very much appreciate you being here. There's so much bad news in the world today, especially regarding the future of the earth. And such news can be numbing, and it can result in depression or denial or woefully inaction in the world. So my key message tonight is that despite the dire trends, it's not too late to save our wonderful coral reefs. Yet time is short and everyone must act and act quickly. My desire this evening is to show how science is part of the solution to saving our reefs, yet only a part. Science alone cannot save the reefs, and I'll make that clear toward the end of my talk. First, I'll briefly review the beauty and complexity of our reefs, including the wonderful goods and services that reefs provide for us for free. Then I'll review the current threats to our reefs, both local and global. Importantly, we can save our reefs from global threats by acting on our local threats, and that's very important. I'll then summarize the science of coral restoration as it's starting to develop here in Hawaii, and then conclude with what everyone in Hawaii can and must do for the future of our reefs. So reefs are considered the rainforest of tropical seas, and that's because they're biodiversity hotspots. There are more species packed on the coral reefs than any other ecosystem on the planet. And it's just mind-boggling to be, I love nothing more than to be underwater on a healthy coral reef. It just completely boggles the mind, the number of species, thousands and thousands, many of which are not even named or known to science yet. This is a Rapture Reef up in the Northwest Hawaiian Islands, French frigate shoals or Lalo, that we'll see is now recovering from hurricane damage, but really one of the most beautiful reefs in the world. Now, this biodiversity, all these species packed on this very small space, are able to do so because there's a remarkable number of what are called mutualisms. Mutualisms are interactions between species that are mutually beneficial. So classic is what's called cleaning symbiosis. You've often seen the little small wrasses that clean ectoparasites off other fish. Here's an example of herbivores, fish that eat limu or seaweed, cleaning, which benefits the turtle by reducing the amount of drag as it swims through the water. Mutually beneficial. Now, fundamentally important on reefs are the internal mutualisms of the corals themselves. That is, as we zoom in on a coral, we see that it's really comprised of a bunch of little clonal polyps, like little sea anemones. And these organisms have little single-celled plant-like microbes in their tissues. You can see there on the right, the little brownish dots. So it's really a symbiosis, if you will, of a plant and an animal living together. The microbes feed the coral some of its photosynthates from photosynthesis, and the coral in return feeds those microbes its nitrogenous waste, its fertilizers, and produces a habitat in which these microbes can live. So a very wonderful mutualism that allows corals to thrive in waters that often don't have much in the way of nutrients naturally. But it's also a fairly delicate mutualism, and it's human activities breaking this mutualism that's one of the greatest threats to reefs, as we'll see. There are also indirect mutualisms. These are mutualisms where species don't really interact directly, but they benefit each other nonetheless. So the most important on the reef are herbivores, that is fish and sea urchins that eat seaweeds or limu. A parrotfish shown here with its beak-like mouth eats the seaweeds on the reef, the limu, and reduces their abundance. The seaweeds in turn would smother corals if they had the opportunity because they grow faster than coral. But because of the parrotfish and other herbivores benefiting the corals are then able to thrive, which produces habitat in turn, not only for the herbivores, but all the other creatures on the reef. Again, a mutualism. And again, a mutualism that's being threatened by human activities. But a healthy reef provides huge bounty for humans. so many things that most of us take for granted and some benefits that many of us aren't even aware of. So obviously reefs provide food, and they are amazing protein factories. Everything from little manini that some people eat whole as juveniles, all the way up to the super large Ulua jacks filmed here up in the Northwest Hawaiian Islands, where there's still abundant because there's no fishing there. Reefs worldwide, even though they occupy less than 1% of the ocean surface, produce some 20% of the world's fisheries catch. And they're an incredibly important protein source for many nations of the world and extremely important here in Hawaii. Many people like to fish, and the reefs are there to allow them to do so. The reefs also protect our coasts. Those uhu, those parrotfish, especially when they're large, are sand producers, shown here. They scrape dead coral surfaces, allowing space for new corals to grow, and in so doing, produce sand. A large parrotfish can produce over 800 pounds of sand a year. Think of that as we watch our beaches start to erode as sea level rise. I bet you never knew that when you're walking on a beach in Hawaii, you're often walking on parrotfish poop. And of course, the reefs cause the waves to break offshore rather than right on the beach, again, protecting us from coastal erosion. And those breaking waves, of course, are a source of recreation, producing some of the best surf spots in the world. And of course, there's always tourism. Call it either a plague or a benefit, but a lot of people come here to be able to enjoy our reefs. And tourism in 2019, right before the pandemic, brought in some $1.2 billion into the state. So reefs help that way as well. But one way that reefs benefit us that very few people think about or know about is that they're a very important source of new medicines. Here's just 3 examples here. And as you can see, very humble organisms like sponges and sea squirts produce chemicals that act as anti-tumor agents, fighting a variety of cancers. And who hasn't been touched by cancer directly or indirectly in their lives? So this is a wonderful pharmaceutical store for us sitting out there. If we only take care of it, it can continue to serve us. So that leads us to the threats to reefs. Now, there's 2 kinds of threats. There's the local threats that we have control over. That is, we in Hawaii can stop these local threats. And then there's the global threats that will require all of humanity. So there's 2 main sets of threats to our reefs. One is really the direct threat, and that has historically been and continues to be poor land use practices. It's important to remember that the ocean is downstream from everything, and everything we do on land ends up affecting the oceans one way or another. So one example is coastal development or coastal agriculture. If it's not done carefully, results in lots of sediment, mud, and silt washing into the ocean during rainstorms. And this sediment literally smothers corals and kills them. And we've lost quite a few of our reefs just from that alone. Also, sewage that leaches into the oceans from either poor septic systems and fertilizers leaching in from fertilizers being applied on land. Those fertilize those seaweeds and help the seaweeds overgrow the corals. Then, of course, there's all the pollutants, everything from sunscreen to oil to any other kind of chemicals, medicines, even sound stresses sea life and can kill sea life. So this has been the main source of the loss of our reefs up to the present. But now there's global threats coming. But before we get to the global threats, there's an issue that affects our reefs, even though it hasn't caused our reefs to degrade. What it's doing is preventing our reefs from being ready for the threats that are coming down to us. And that threat is overfishing. Now, I am not against fishing. I love seafood. I know many people who fish, and I fish. So it's not about the fishing community being bad. It's the fact that in every community, there are bad apples, like the guys shown here. These are guys who went out at night using scuba and wiped out all the uhu, all the parrotfish on a reef. Those are the bluish and reddish fish you see lying there. While these fish slept in holes at night, they were sitting ducks and they were wiped out. This is not the kind of fishing that allows our reefs to persist, because these are the fish, again, that keep our reefs clean so corals can thrive. And there's plenty of evidence, scientific evidence, showing us that in fact, our reefs have been depleted by fishing. The fishing isn't causing the degradation of the reefs, but it is going to prevent our reefs from recovering as the seaweeds take over. Especially in terms of these global threats. So let's look at these. This is what's caused by climate change. And as we burn more and more fossil fuels, as we clear the forests of the world, more and more carbon dioxide is causing an enhanced greenhouse effect, which is causing our atmosphere to warm and in turn our ocean to warm. So this is a temperature trend from Hawaii. You see the years since 1900 projected into the future, the end of this century, and the increase in temperature in degrees Fahrenheit. There's already been plenty of warming taking place. The future will depend on how much carbon emissions there are and whether we are going to have a very warm climate and ocean or only a moderately warm climate and ocean. Now, that warming ocean is worsening our storms. You've seen recently Hurricane Ida hitting and causing much damage in Louisiana. That storm was fueled by warm water, which is caused by ocean warming. We've been pretty lucky in Hawaii so far in terms of direct hits on hurricane. But as a warning to us, Hurricane Walaka in 2018, which you can see in the track here, bypassed the main islands and then hooked up and crossed the Northwest Islands, made a direct hit on French frigate shoals. And that reef I showed you earlier, Rapture Reef, there on the upper right, was completely erased off French frigate shoals. You can see in the photograph on the lower right. Now, that was a devastating effect on reefs, but fortunately, my colleagues recently went back up and checked out this reef just a month or so ago, and the corals are returning. The corals are returning because there's lots of herbivores up there keeping those dead surfaces clean so baby corals can settle and grow. Which brings us to the 800-pound gorilla, coral bleaching. Now, there's also ocean acidification taking place. I'm not going to talk about that today because that's more an issue for the future. But right now, we're starting to deal with coral bleaching. Now, probably everyone's heard of it, but I want to review, make sure you understand the mechanisms. First, those single-celled microbes that live in the corals. When the water becomes too warm, that mutualism, that symbiosis breaks down. And at that point, the microbes sort of become parasites to the corals. So the corals expel them from their tissues. The microbes are what give the corals their color. They're called zooxanthellae, type of dinoflagellate. And when those things are expelled, the coral loses its color and looks bleached, it looks white. That's why we call it coral bleaching. It's not really chemical bleaching per se. Now, if the water gets cool enough, rapidly enough, the zoox will repopulate the coral and the coral will survive. But if it stays warm, that coral colony will die. And again, if the herbivores aren't there, then seaweeds will take over, and then we've lost that coral and perhaps that reef. And it's happening more and more. So we go from a healthy coral reef, like this shot of the Kona coast before bleaching, and then over just a couple days, all the trees of this wonderful rainforest to see the corals can turn white as snow. And it's happening more and more frequently. Here in Hawaii, the first major bleaching event was detected in 1996. We subsequently had back-to-back bleaching events in 2014 and 2015, 2015 being especially bad. 2019, we had a minor bleaching event. And just now, the North Shore of Hawaii is starting to show some bleaching this year, 2021. So you can see the bleaching events are becoming more and more frequent through time. And when they're severe, a severely bleached leaf will die and degrade. And that's the tragic loss of reefs. Worldwide, we've already lost about 30 to 50% of coral reefs around the world already. And things are just getting started. In Hawaii, we've been relatively lucky, but in 2015, that bleaching event alone killed about 32% of the shallow corals on the main Hawaiian islands. This is mostly along the Kohala Kona coast of the Big Island and around Maui. That's a huge loss. And we're hoping those corals will come back. So I'm sorry to drag everybody through hell here, but this is the threat that we're facing. And unfortunately, we ain't seen nothing yet. The problems that we're facing with the ocean are accelerating exponentially. So lots of bad stuff is coming down the pike to us through time. But there's still time. So instead of going into depression, I'm hoping you'll go into activism. There are solutions. Science is making some of the contributions, and everybody else must make contributions as well. But let's look at the science, since this is a science talk. There's a new science called coral restoration, in which scientists are seeking means of helping corals resist climate change and other assaults that are happening to them. A big study was published in 2019 by the National Academy of Sciences. It involved faculty from UH Manoa who are involved in this study. And they compiled all the possible ideas or interventions, as they called them, for saving corals. Some of these ideas are practical and make sense. And I'll show you some of these being done in Hawaii. Some of them are crazy. So first, there's genetic and reproductive interventions. These are ways of assisting corals in reproducing. And I'll show you an example of that later. One of the ideas, though, are genetically modified corals, which isn't being tried in Hawaii, and I don't know if it would be particularly popular, but at least identifying those corals that can naturally resist ocean warming and ocean acidification, so-called supercorals, and propagating those so that they can help to fight climate disruption. Then there's the environmental interventions. This is where things can get a little weird. These are things like putting big shades over the reefs so they don't get warm or hot, and other ways trying to cool the reefs artificially. Most of the ideas are fairly strange and require a huge amount of engineering and money and probably not be very popular. Then there's physiological interventions. These are ways of trying to enhance the ability of corals to resist bleaching and to resist the effects of algal overgrowth or ocean acidification or what have you. And then some of the more practical methods are called coral population and community interventions. That's mostly what we're going to start to try here in Hawaii, just helping the corals do what they do naturally. So looking here in Hawaii, um, there's a consortium of organizations and agencies that are starting to work together, either formally or loosely. There's the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. There's environmental organizations, especially the Nature Conservancy, which is working directly with NOAA. There's the State Division of Aquatic Resources, which is conducting some work, which I'll show you. And then, of course, there's also all the scientists at UH Manoa. Now, I'd love to name names. There's a lot of really wonderful people working on all these issues, but it would take too long because there's so many of them. And I know I'd forget somebody, and I don't want to offend anybody. Needless to say, there's a lot of very good, very concerned scientists in Hawaii working on these issues. Now, at NOAA and TNC, they've started a process also working with DAR and UH Manoa scientists, and we've sort of working through these steps of coral restoration. Really at the beginning, just testing methods to see what will work and won't work. So that's sort of the goal. Sites have been identified, I'll show you momentarily, and also the interventions, you will, or the coral restoration methods. Then we'll work into an implementation plan and finally get things started. So the sites where we're going to test methods here in Hawaii were selected by a committee, and it includes 2 sites here on Oahu. One of the most degraded reefs on the island, off Waikiki, also probably the most pristine reef, Hanauma Bay. We're not talking about inshore Hanauma Bay, we're talking about offshore where people don't go. Then Olowalu on Maui, and 2 sites on the Big Island. And there are a variety of reasons these sites were chosen, but they provide a range of habitats to try these different restoration methods and see what works and what doesn't work under different environments. So here's all the methods we're using. And they're all safe methods. We're not trying anything weird so far. So first is corals of opportunity, or COO. Corals of opportunity are corals that have been dislodged by wave action or have been removed by artificial structures that are being pulled out of the water or otherwise destroyed. So these are corals that are growing naturally that would die if we didn't do something with them. So scientists are out there now stabilizing these things on reefs, but also transplanting them to areas where the corals have died. And I'll show you some examples of that. Well, actually, here's a photograph. These little coral nubbins being added to a patch on a reef. There's coral gardening. That's where we take corals of opportunities, or we selectively collect corals that are naturally resistant to bleaching so that we can grow them and propagate them for transplanting elsewhere. This is a platform that was built by NOAA off the reef runway, where you can see corals of opportunities are being carefully monitored and saved for future use. There's also coral gardening taking place at the Hawaii Institute of Marine Biology in Kaneohe Bay. There's enhanced reproduction, that is trying to either preserve the gametes of corals, the eggs and the sperm, for later in case corals are severely affected. This is happening out at HIMB, but also spawning the corals in the lab and then taking those larvae that we rear and seeding them on reefs that aren't naturally receiving larvae that will grow into future corals, enhanced reproduction. And then there's substrate addition. This can be done with what's called biorock, which is putting little metal frames out in the water, running a weak electric current through them, which causes calcification to start, which is attractive to corals. Live rock, which is chunks of reef that have crustose coralline algae growing on them, which is a preferred settlement surface for coral larvae, and moving that around to different areas. And then artificial structures. And all four of these sort of approaches can be merged with each other. So one example is what the Division of Aquatic Resources, DAR, is doing at their coral lab. These are little structures, artificial structures about a square foot or so in size, and little nubbins of corals of opportunity are then glued to the outside. You can see there on the left. Those are then cultured till the whole thing becomes a de facto coral head and then transplanted out on the reef. A very clever way of helping the corals grow and replenish areas where the corals have died. My lab is doing similar sorts of work with artificial structures that we've put out, little sort of modules or artificial coral heads, if you will. We want to see if we can attract herbivores to sites where there isn't shelter, such as highly degraded reefs. We've had this study going for about 5 years so far. And what we've found is that in the reefs off Waikiki, they're so degraded that no herbivores are settling, or very few, to these structures. So they're all getting covered by thick algal overgrowth, that is seaweeds, and less coral is growing there. Whereas putting these modules, and these are all put out in the sand, so we're not bothering existing corals. At Hanauma Bay, where there's many herbivores and lots of larvae coming in from the outside, there's urchins and fish colonizing these structures. They're keeping the algae very thin, and more coral is growing on those modules. So those are all examples of the sorts of things we're starting to do here in Hawaii. And it's so much fun to watch baby corals grow, showing them when you have some success at what you're doing. So this is just one coral colony on one of our modules where there was grazing by herbivores. The scale mark there is centimeters, about ½ an inch. You can see that little baby coral growing substantially over a couple years. Corals do not grow quickly. We're talking on an order of a centimeter a year. So it's a long-term process to get the corals to grow back after they've died. But despite all this good science that's taking place, science alone cannot save our reefs. There's no question about that. The effort that it takes to try to restore a reef is monumental. Better to have that reef naturally replenish itself. And that's where all of us come in, everyone. And I'd like to share with you a vision that many people in Hawaii have, using this wonderful image of Papahanao, Mother Earth, if you will. And that's an image of Hawaii as a showcase for the world of sustainability, where in Hawaii, we do things right. And because of all the visitors who come here, we show them the right way, and we help guide the rest of the world to do the right thing. And doing so requires two groups of people to take action. One are courageous leaders that are willing to go against the naysayers and the vocal minority who don't want to change things for the better for their own reasons. And of course, engaged citizens who push their leaders to do the right thing. Now, here in Hawaii, Governor Ige has what's called the 30 by 30 initiative. And part of that initiative, which is very forward thinking, is to ensure that at least 30% of our reefs in state waters are well protected and enhanced for the future by the year 2030. An admirable goal, but this is not a law. This is the governor's vision. And if any kind of fishing regulations are involved in this, there's always a lot of pushback by those who don't want to be regulated. And this is where the public comes in to do the right thing. So we really have a choice here. Our reefs are heading towards degradation with the status quo. And the status quo involves poor land use practices, which are continuing and people are trying to stop. Plastic debris, which I didn't talk about. Invasive species, another issue I didn't have time to talk about today. There's the overfishing of herbivores, which is a big issue. Sea level rise and worsening storms, coral bleaching and acidification. All these things are affecting our reefs, all in unison, holistically. And the alternative is for all of us in Hawaii to turn toward clean watersheds, getting rid of single-use plastics, which end up in the ocean, biosecurity against invasive species, catching invasive species before they get established, regulating fishing, not in a way that stops fishing, but in a way that returns to the Pono practices that the ancient Hawaiians practiced. Renewable energy that addresses climate disruption directly, reforestation to pull carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. We have colleagues at UH Manoa who are very active in this. And local agriculture and aquaculture. Growing our own food in Hawaii will very much lower the carbon footprint of what we do. These are all things we can do if there's political will and enough citizens demanding this action. So what can you do as an average citizen? Well, the International Coral Reef Society has come up with 12 pledges for coral reefs, and they're all just sort of commonsensical things. The first is support policies for coral reefs. That is to vote for people who are willing to conserve our reefs, advocate for science-based decision making, and communicate priorities to our policymakers. They have to be told what to do. Of course, we can reduce our carbon footprint and all our personal assaults on reef. Not using single-use plastics, eating sustainable seafood, and please give the uhu a break. They need it. Limit our use of chemicals, cutting our carbon emissions, reduce, reuse, recycle. And of course, promoting education and awareness of coral reef conservation, participating in local fundraisers and activities, educating yourself and others. You've done that tonight. Thank you very much. And sharing this pledge of the ICRS with others. So I want to leave you with the practices that Native Hawaiians used. They had to survive, and they ended up managing their reefs in a way that produced fisheries sustainable. And they have a saying that if we care for the oceans will care for you. And that's where we need to go. And this is especially true for the keiki, our kids and grandkids. If we don't turn around what's happening these days, they're the ones who are going to suffer the most. So mahalo for listening tonight, and I'm happy to answer questions. Thank you.
So thank you, Dr. Hickson. That was fascinating. And it's nice to hear some hopeful words. I'd like to ask, does anybody have some questions they would like to address?
Of
Go ahead,
course.
Patty.
I thought oxygen was one of the things that the coral reefs produce for us.
Oxygen, well, any photosynthesis produces oxygen.
Right.
Yes, absolutely.
That was something very important there. That's right.
Well, the reefs aren't the major producers of oxygen in the ocean. The primary producers of oxygen, the oxygen we breathe, are actually the phytoplankton.
Phytoplankton,
Single-celled
right.
plants that grow out in the open ocean.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. But I thought reefs were part of it too. So,
Sure.
okay.
Yeah, reefs provide lots of things. I didn't have time to give everything they do for us.
Exactly.
Looks like Edward Maloney has a question, and then we'll go to Sui Lun. Edward?
Hello. Yeah, I wanted to ask how environmentalists can compete against, industrial capitalist interests, seen as how they are typically prioritized in the government sector.
Well, that's the perennial problem, isn't it? But
Yes.
one thing I have found in my work in various places around the world is that a fully engaged citizenry will cause the politicians to respond. So I've once been told by people in Congress, for example, that if they get just a dozen handwritten letters by citizens coming to their office, they will pay attention. So it's a matter of people saying, this is what we want. And if enough people do that, the politicians want to keep their jobs, so they will respond. But in this state, there's a lot of money and a lot of power keeping things going in the wrong direction. There's no question about it. That's the big issue. Thanks for asking that.
Thank you for the great talk.
Sue Elon, you had a question.
Dr. Hickson, I am an ocean swimmer and I swim off Waikiki because it's close. I love swimming from Kaimana to the Sheraton. But every other year we have spearfishing allowed. And I'm wondering, this year is an off spearfishing year, and there's a lot of fish at the reef. And then on January 1st, within a week, the place is decimated. What can we do? Oh, okay. I'm assuming that some of those herbivores, the big ones that chew up the algae and so forth, they're the ones that we need, but those are the ones that the fishermen like the best because they're good eats. So is that something that we should, I mean, I've tried working very hard against that, but is that something that would really make a big difference, is stopping the on and off of spearfishing?
So the on and off, there's just that one Waikiki site is the only place on the island where that's allowed, where the site is closed for a while, the fish populations build up, then it's opened, and you're right, within a couple of weeks, all the fish are gone. So this was set up actually to allow sort of a biannual fishing derby, if you will. It's not intended to conserve the reefs, and it certainly does not conserve the reefs. However, if you go to a place that's protected from fishing, such as offshore Hanama Bay, not talking inshore, it's been trampled to death by so many tourists. But if you go off out in the deeper water, there's plenty of fish there. And it's been shown time and time again, if you give a place a break, the fish communities will come back. Now, the problem is we don't want to just shut down fishing altogether. Fishing is a very important part of life in Hawaii. At the same time, there's no question that herbivores, especially the uhu, the big parrotfish, are overfished. So what's needed is for people to back off and to police each other and call out those who are doing the pillaging. Now, the Division of Aquatic Resources is right now trying to implement some fishing regulations for herbivores, and they're receiving lots and lots of pushback from those who don't want there to be regulations. What's needed are the people who do want there to be regulations to be speaking up and making that very clear. There was a bill before the state legislature a couple of years ago that actually directed DAR to protect herbivores, and that bill failed in committee because not enough people supported it. So there are people who want to do the right thing, but people need to speak up. And there's so many fishermen out there who are Pono fishermen. They're not raping and pillaging. You see the guy out there with his fishing pole in the morning, catching a couple fish for his family. That's not the problem. The problem are those who don't care, who are pillaging our reefs. They're the ones who have to be stopped.
Well, I don't even go down there on New Year's Day because it's like the whole beach is filled with gun happy um, underwater gun happy fishermen that just they're gone. The fish are gone in a week.
Yeah, it's what's called a fishing derby.
Yeah.
It opens, everybody takes the fish and they're gone. I mean, what we're seeing here slowly unfolding was what's called the tragedy of the commons. It happens on land as well as in the sea. It is when you have a resource that's fully open to exploitation, which basically it is in Hawaii. We don't have fishing licenses, and the government's not funded well enough to enforce fishing regulations. When it's a free for all, many people will think, if I don't take that fish, somebody else will, so I'm going to take it. And in fact, I'm going to take as many as I can and sell the extra. So we need to change at a societal level.
Mhm.
That sounds like a role for groups like your swim club and other groups that use the ocean to be aware and to advocate for
Right.
the laws where they don't.
And actually,
necessarily-
please email me sometime. I'm actually working with a group of very talented media people to try to do a public, sort of a public education campaign, if you will, about these very issues, because not enough people know about it. And, the state doesn't have the money to do it. And these people are volunteering their time and energy. And we're getting some wonderful spokespeople from the community to, to get the word out, and eventually we'll get it done. So
Okay.
anyone wants to email me who's interested, we'll somehow fold you in. Thank
Okay.
you.
Thank you.
That sounds terrific. We have a couple questions in the chat. One, what is your opinion of the genetically modified corals, of that approach?
Well, it's not being done in Hawaii. What's being done in Hawaii is trying to identify the genetic basis, the natural genetic basis of resistance to coral bleaching. It's very strange. When bleaching takes place, there'll be one colony that bleaches and dies, and right next to it will be another colony that doesn't bleach and die of the same species. There's something about differences within the coral, be it the genetics of the coral itself, or probably the genetics of what's called the microbiome, all the bacteria and viruses that live inside the coral and live with the coral. And identifying those strains is important. And all we want to do is propagate them. There are those elsewhere, not in Hawaii, who want to actually then create, these GMOs of corals. And of course, we've seen in Hawaii that there's issues with that, and they're probably not going to be very popular. But right now, here in Hawaii, we're just trying to help the corals do what they do naturally and help propagate those that are naturally resistant.
We also have a question on what role engineers have to play in resolving environmental issues.
Well, the engineers are very helpful when it comes to designing artificial structures for propagating corals. So I mentioned this idea of what's called I forgot the name of it, but it's putting out these metal structures. This is being done elsewhere in the world. It hasn't really happened here yet. You put out these metal frameworks and you run a very weak electric current through them, not enough to cause any damage at all, but it actually starts causing calcification on the structure that is attractive to coral larvae. And then the larvae settle and grow very rapidly on these structures. And you have basically a coral head that's been artificially propagated. That's engineering. These structures that I showed you the slides of are artificial engineered structures as well. So it really has to do with artificial things we put out in the water that facilitate the settlement and growth of corals.
You mentioned the structures that you put out off of Waikiki, where it's pretty much just sand, are not attracting coral polyps and the feeders that would keep the algae at bay. Do you see any mitigations that might improve that?
So that was very disappointing to us. We were hoping, I mean, I've put these sort of modules out in different parts of the world, the Bahamas, the US Virgin Islands, elsewhere, and they always attract fish. They just get packed with fish in a fairly short amount of time, not off Waikiki. And my sense is that the reefs off Waikiki have degraded to the point where they're not chemically or sonically attractive to settling fish larvae anymore. And that's really a tragedy. It could mean that these reefs have been pushed beyond the brink. Now, the way to get it back is going to be, I would say, to close some sections of those reefs to fishing permanently and wait for the fish to eventually come back. Hopefully they will, or maybe to seed these reefs with herbivores. One thing that's been very successful in Kaneohe to reduce the abundance of invasive seaweeds there is to culture sea urchins and put them out on the reefs. Division of Aquatic Resources is doing that. It's been very successful. And I have plans now to work with DAR to start seeding these modules with their urchins, hoping that that will clear enough space so that corals can start settling and growing. So there are things we can do, but some of these reefs are more degraded than we had anticipated.
We have a question about following up on your reference to the Hawaiian approach to doing things. And do you feel that the scientific and Hawaiian knowledge systems are meshing, are working together or not?
Well, they should, or they aren't, but I certainly know Native Hawaiian scientists and Native Hawaiian practitioners who are working with Western scientists. And I believe that the combination of traditional ecological knowledge and what Western science brings is a combination that is really the solution. Merging those two ways of knowledge together. They're both extremely valuable. The Hawaiians did just fine before the Europeans arrived without Western science. And we're starting to face issues in the oceans that no one has ever dealt with before. Ocean warming and acidification. And that's where Western science can help. One thing is certain, what has happened in the past is nothing compared to what is going to be happening in the future. So it's going to be collaborations and partnerships among everyone who is affected and involved, working together, that will be the solutions to ensuring that our reefs persist for future generations.
Sarah Lynn would like to know what you enjoy most about your job.
I love being underwater on a nice, healthy coral reef. There's nothing, it's my nirvana on this planet. I am just in ecstasy when I'm on a healthy reef, seeing all the different fish and all the different animals and the healthy corals just doing their thing. It is the most fabulous experience I've ever had. And that said, I have known reefs that have died, gone from being in a healthy state to dying. These were reefs in the Bahamas that were hit by the severe first global bleaching event in 1997. And that was actually the most heartbreaking thing I've ever seen. Coral heads that I'd known for decades, fish that I'd known for many years, disappearing. And it's a very strange sensation to have your face mask filling with tears. So really, reefs have provided both the agony and the ecstasy in my life. Thanks for asking.
So someone would like to know if you have a favorite snorkel or scuba spot on Oahu that you wouldn't mind sharing.
Oh, my favorite spot is going out to the mouth of Hanauma Bay, getting away from the crowds. We actually, in our research, take scooters from the beach and zoom out there. We have special permits to do that. Obviously, it's difficult to access, but I guess you could always go in underwater from outside the boundary inside, but it's wonderful out there. But you know, it's no fishing zone. It's just to be observed and studied and appreciated.
Do you use any volunteers in your research?
Yes, but unfortunately, we can only use volunteers that are certified as official University of Hawaii scientific divers, and that's a very onerous certification to get. So most of our volunteers are actually students at UH Manoa.
We had a technical question. Does metal degrade through in the ocean as a substrate for coral generation?
It depends upon the metal. That's a very good question. If you stick out a standard piece of iron, it will rust in no time in the ocean. But there are grades of stainless steel, for example, that are completely impervious to seawater. In fact, we use that stainless steel banding to hold together the modules that we make. And the structures that I was talking about earlier, the ones that currents are passed through, those are able to be covered by calcium carbonate soon enough that they don't rust away, and they actually just sort of form the core of what eventually becomes a coral colony.
You used to hear about shipwrecks or even sunken vehicles, things that were dropped down in to be a base for the reef. Is that still done, or was that found not to be effective?
That was done in the past, especially out on the Windward Coast. A bunch of car bodies were dumped overboard. And if you go diving there now, you might find a few engine blocks. That's all that's left. Everything else has rusted away. Shipwrecks are a little different. They're meant to be relatively impervious to the elements. And so once they get a coating of growth on them, they tend to stop rusting away. That's the situation. Most recently, artificial reef work in Hawaii, done by the Division of Aquatic Resources, has used concrete structures that obviously don't rust. But there were some problems in some of the deployments where they landed on living coral, and right now artificial reefs aren't particularly popular in this state with a lot of people. Although I believe they can be used effectively to restore reefs if they're built properly and have lots and lots of pukas in them for fish and sea urchins to shelter.
Do you still do work in the Bahamas? Did they ever recover from the damage, or does that seem like a permanent loss?
The broader Caribbean region is one of the worst in the world. They've lost most of their corals. This is true in the Florida Keys, the Bahamas, and the greater Caribbean region. It's really very much tragic. And it's sort of a lesson for Hawaii, because the Caribbean was overfished a long time ago, severely. It didn't have the native Hawaiian population that was fishing sustainably. And so the herbivores are absent from much of those reefs, and they're covered in seaweeds.
I have a question about Australia. Is there hope for Australia?
Oh, Australia. I spent a year sabbatical working on the Great Barrier Reef, and it was wonderful. It was before all the recent death. The Great Barrier Reef, although it's in a, how did that come on? I don't know how that slide came on, but anyway, the Great Barrier Reef is in a very well-developed nation, Australia, but it's not very well protected for a variety of reasons. And it's been subject to a variety of assaults. Before coral bleaching became common, there was an outbreak of a coral predator called a crown of thorns sea star. We have them in Hawaii, but they've never been in the outbreak levels. Although there is a sea star called the cushion star that's starting to become worriedly more abundant, especially off Waikiki. We're studying that now. But anyway, the crown of thorns outbreak in Hawaii killed a huge percent of the corals on the Great Barrier Reef, sorry. And now coral bleaching events are hitting the Great Barrier Reef severely. It started in the north, which is closer to the equator in Australia, and year by year, the bleaching events are getting worse and worse and moving steadily away from the equator toward the South Great Barrier Reef. It's truly tragic.
We have a question about what you think about the BioRock.
BioRock is the that's that electric frame stuff. There's evidence of it working very well in other parts of the world. You can go online and see these structures that are just fully covered with corals in a very quick amount of time. It's not been tried in Hawaii yet, to my knowledge. It'd be interesting to see if it is something that is viable here.
Given what you've seen, how do you maintain your sense of optimism? And I gather that you do think there's hope.
Well, thank you. That's a very important question. Ultimately, there's only two choices in life. There's hope and there's despair. And despair is manifested as depression, denial, inaction, and indifference. And the more people choose despair, the more in trouble we're going to be. So I'm not super optimistic about the future, but I am hopeful because I am going to continue to do the good fight until my dying breath. I have grandchildren. I'm concerned for their future. I'm concerned for the future of everyone. So I'm going down fighting if I'm going down. And that's my hope. And one thing that gives me tremendous hope, having been a university professor now for going on 40 years, is the present generation of students are activists. They're very concerned about the future. And I've never seen more activism and true hope than I am in the faces of college students these days. And I'm constantly apologizing to them for the foibles of their parents and grandparents. Our generation has failed miserably. I'm hoping that the Greta Thunbergs of the world and all young people will be successful.
That's a wonderful message, I think, to close on. It is hopeful. It's good to hear that you're seeing that among the young people. And so we'll close it if there's no final questions. We have some mahalos. People have said this is inspiring. As I mentioned, we will share the link for the video if people want to go back and watch again. And if you send it to me, we'll send along the 12 steps the Reef Association has provided, and people can use that maybe as a guideline for their own practices.
Well, thank you all so very much. I so much appreciate you all showing up after the end of a long work day. Stay safe, everyone. Aloha.
Aloha, and thank you, Mark, and thank you all for joining us this evening.